Welcome to the third lecture in the series. In my previous class, I discussed with you the cell theory and how the concept of cell as the basic unit of life developed over a period of time, and how cell organizes itself structurally, how it looks like from outside and from inside, depending upon the tools and technologies available. The structure of cell was deciphered completely. And today we know that how a cell organizes itself, how it looks like, what all internal organelles are present, you know. So next question was that what is this cell made up of? What are the constituents? This question was addressed in last century, and our knowledge in this depend or depended on the discoveries, and our knowledge increased in the field of chemistry. So the biological system were chemically analyzed, be it was bacteria or plants or animals. So the whole organisms were taken, I mean, wherever it was possible, or parts of the organisms were taken, and chemical analysis was done to find out what kind of elements make up the living tissues or organisms. And very interesting information uh, came by doing this analysis, you know, that all the living beings, starting from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, uh, bacteria to plants to animals to human beings, they are all made up of basic elements, you know, like the elements were divided into essential and the trace elements. And if you look at the essential elements which constitute the living system, is basically carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, magnesium. So these are the elements which are categorized as essential elements and which constitute the living system. And trace elements like copper, iodine, and fat. You know, so uh, I mean, life wherever it is, or living cell wherever it exists, it consists of these elements chemically. Okay, so but then the question is that how these elements come together and take give a structural shape, and also allows cells to perform functions, the biochemical functions, in terms of synthesis and degradations. You know, that is what is going on, what goes on in a cell. So, uh, further analysis in terms of chemical compounds, which constitutes a living system. So, from elements to the compounds. So, if we see, there are all the compounds which constitute the living cell, they fall into two categories. One is the organic substances and inorganic substances, you know, and they all participate in the metabolic processes. within the cell. Okay, and also you have to keep in mind that they also participate in the structural organization of the cells also. Okay, so when we further look into what are the inorganic compounds and what are the organic substances. So inorganic substances or compounds are those which can be dissolved in water or react with water to release ions. Broadly, they are defined as the inorganic substances, for example, electrolytes. Organic substances, they may be dissolved in water, but are more likely to get dissolved in organic solvents or liquids like ether and alcohol. And they are non-electrolytes. So, so all the compounds which constitute a living cell or life, inorganic and organic, the two categories. What are inorganic substances? Inorganic substances, those who can dissolve in water or react with water to release ions, electrolytes, for example, and organic substances, they are more soluble in organic liquids or solvents like alcohol and ether, and they are non-electrolytes and they don't release any ions. Okay. Now, further, when we look at what are the inorganic substances, for example, so there are four key substances like water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and salts. These are the inorganic substances which are found in living cells or living systems or living organisms if you do chemical analysis. And very interestingly, water is a major component or constituent of living cell and living organism. For example, if you look at the human body, it has two-thirds of weight is because of water. Okay, so water is the major constraint of life. In all sorts of life, from prokaryote to eukaryote, you have to keep this in mind. I'm not concentrating on one type of organism. It's a general discussion, and you have to keep in mind that water is a common and major constraint of a living cell or living organisms. When we come to the organic substances, there are four major macromolecules which constitute a living cell. For example, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acid. So these are the four macromolecules which constitute a bacterial cell, a plant cell, and an animal cell, and a human cell. So now, it becomes very interesting that these are the four macromolecules which are constituting life starting from bacteria to humans. So we will look at all these four macromolecules very broadly. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but as a student for biotechnology, you must remember all these facts all the time, which I'm sharing with you. So let us look at what are the carbohydrates, for example. Now, carbohydrates are basically, they provide energy to the living system. So not only they are providers of energy, but also they, the energy is stored in the for future uses. So basically, carbohydrates are energy providers, and this can also be stored in the form of carbohydrates. Okay. Uh, now there are simple carbohydrates and complex. If if you further look into this, the building blocks for complex carbohydrate are the simple glucose, wherein you have carbon dioxide, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They come together. Like, for example, in glucose, you have C6H12O6, means you have 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygen coming together in the form of this structure, and form a glucose moiety, which is the building block for complex carbohydrates. This is the simplest form of carbohydrates. And then you have uh, monosaccharides like glucose and fructose, and then you have disaccharides where two glucose moieties come together to form sucrose or lactose. They are disaccharides. And then you have polysaccharides wherein hundreds and thousands of these glucose moieties come together, and they form complex carbohydrates, starch, glycogen, chitin, and some of them they participate in structure formation and otherwise as a stored material. So, for example, in cell wall, you have complex polysaccharides, cellulose, hemicellulose. So they constitute the cell wall implants. So they are contributing towards the structural organization. Otherwise, they are starch and source of energy, carbohydrates. They break down into the simpler forms of like glucose and fructose. So both structurally and functionally, they contribute towards the living cell. Coming to lipids, lipids is again is a source of energy, and also they participate in structural organization. So if you remember, the membrane structure is nothing but lipid and protein, and the cell is nothing but the manifestation of membrane, starting from the outer membrane to all the inner organelles. They are made up of membrane only, So it's a membranous structure. Cell is a membranous structure, and lipid is one of the component of the membrane along with protein. So lipids are again very important organic compound which constitute cells, starting from bacteria to humans. You know, you have to keep this in mind. I'm repeating time and again that macromolecules like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids are seen from bacteria to human beings. So focusing on lipids. So there are different kinds of lipids, phospholipids and steroids, and fatty acids are the building blocks, and they perform the vital functions in the cell, So, and here, like carbohydrates, you have glucose, the monomers are the building blocks. In lipids, you have triglycerides as the building blocks. So, and then there are saturated fats, unsaturated fats, and polysaturated fats. So there are different kinds of, when I say lipids, there are different thousands types of lipid molecules which constitute, but broad everything is put in lipids. Okay, so coming to the another macromolecule like proteins, so they are again made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur, and they are they they contribute in the structural organization of the cell or living organism, and also they contribute significantly in the metabolic processes. You know, they are the source of hormones. They represent antibodies, for example, enzymes, proteins are they act also as enzymes which catalyze all the biochemical reactions which go on within the cell. So therefore, proteins are very, very important component. All four of them are important component, but then proteins contribute structurally and in a way controls the cell metabolism when they act as enzyme, you know, and enzymes are the key, you know, and the proteins are coded by genes in the nucleus. And so whatever goes on within the cell through these enzymes is controlled by nuclear DNA in turn by genes. So if there is an enzyme, there is a protein, there is a gene to it, you know, and that's how the genes within the cell, they try to control the processes which goes on. What kind of process will go on in what type of cell at a given point of time. And all this is controlled by, uh, by enzymes, proteins, and the genes. If the gene is not expressing at a given point of time, the protein is not made, the enzyme is not produced, and the biochemical reaction doesn't go on. Okay? And like you have seen in carbohydrates, lipids, proteins are made up of amino acids. Amino acid is the building block basically for proteins, and there are 20 different kinds of amino acids which come together in different combinations to make thousands and thousands of types of proteins in living organisms, starting from bacteria to humans. You know, so again, these are only 20 amino acids which are present starting from bacteria to humans, which make proteins. Okay, so and then these proteins have different structures: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. And ultimately, it is the quaternary structure, you know, the way proteins or fold themselves or inside the cell determines their function. You know, if a protein is not folding itself properly, then it is not able to perform its function. You know, so the structure, ultimately, the structural organization of the protein in the cell to perform a function is very, very important. You know. So this is very, very important component, and now we know a lot about this aspect, and we will see as and when we require. I'll give you the details of and the significance of these kind of the structural organization of proteins within the cell. Uh, Okay, coming to the nucleic acids, last but not the not the least, but very, very important component of the cell is the nucleic acids. You know. Again, they are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and nucleotides are the building blocks here. You know, so basically there are two types of nucleic acids. You have RNA and you have DNA. Okay, and RNA is a single-stranded molecule, and there are three kinds of RNA. You have mRNA, you have tRNA, and rRNA. As you know, the tRNA and rRNA are the molecules which are helpful in protein synthesis, whereas mRNA is the one which has the information about the kind of protein and the kind of amino acids are going to line up together to form a protein. Okay, and then you have the DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and they also contain a sugar molecule and the phosphorus. You know, it's a double-stranded structure. You know, and it is this molecule where the information about the the kind of protein uh, is to be synthesized within the cell is contained. So DNA contains all the information about different kinds of proteins needed to be synthesized within the cell, you know, and that building block we call as genes. So gene, there is a protein and there is a gene. Now that was a theory which was proposed long, long ago, one gene, one protein theory, but it is now, it had been undergoing change time to time. Then it came that since the proteins are made up of different peptides coming together, so one gene, one peptide theory came. And now we know that one gene, one protein, and this protein can perform more than one function, within the cell, depending upon the kind of conformation it has and the kind of post-translational modification it undergoes, like glycosylation and other, you know. So the old concept of one gene, one protein hypothesis, which was given earlier, holds no longer true, you know. So uh, this is this has undergone change, and now we know that a gene can be responsible for more than one function, depending upon the protein it is making, how it is interacting with other proteins to participate in a different in a particular function of the cell. So to conclude this part, basically what I have tried to tell you is that the living cell, which is the unit of life, what it is made up of. So basically, the living cell is made up of inorganic, organic. In organic, you have four macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acid. And now the interesting part here is, and which we will be looking at more critically, that DNA DNA is the same from bacteria to humans. It is the same basis ATGC which make the DNA, major part of the DNA in bacteria, and the same is in plants, and same is in animals and the human beings. Okay, so the question is that when it is the same DNA and the same kind of protein made up of 20 amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates, when all of them are same, then how a bacteria is bacteria, plant is plant, and animal is animal. In other words, how this complexity in living forms is achieved. It's a major, major question of today to understand that how same DNA manifests itself in bacterial cell differently, plants differently, animals differently, and how this complexity of life has come from simple form of life like viruses and bacteria to the humans. Okay, so we will be looking at this aspect when we, in the next lecture, when I look at the organization of nuclear genome, okay, in eukaryotes. So thank you very much for patient hearing.